Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. When I was a child, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder was a term that was hardly known by laypeople. Over the past few decades, this condition, also known as ADHD, has garnered so much notice that it appears to be a household term. And yet, much remains misunderstood about ADHD, including the topic of this episode, how it relates to girls. Indeed, many girls and women have this condition but have been overlooked and untreated. What are challenges that are unique to girls with ADHD? How does it present differently in girls from how it presents in boys? And most importantly, what can be done to assist girls who are contending with ADHD in their lives so they can live more fully? Fortunately, I know just the guy to ask. Dr. Stephen Hinshaw is a world-renowned clinician, a distinguished professor, and a major researcher on ADHD. He teaches at UC Berkeley and at UCSF Medical School and has written many books, including his most recent, Straight Talk About ADHD in Girls, How to Help Your Daughter Thrive. This is a book that has been described as a must-read from members of the scientific community, as well as from parents who are trying to help their children with this condition. So listen in as Stephen and I talk about ADHD in girls and how to assist them in thriving. Dr. Stephen Hinshaw, who has asked me to call him Steve, welcome to Super Psyched.
Great to be here.
So delighted. And you're speaking about today with my listeners about a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, ADHD in its many forms, especially as it relates to women who are so often overlooked. Before we even get into the weeds on this, what is ADHD and what is it not? Because there are so many misconceptions about it. I'm so ADHD, or I've got ADD is another term that we often hear people say about themselves, and they may not. But let's just hear from your vantage point. What is it?
So just a brief history. Around the time that compulsory education started in Europe and the United States, the medical field began to write case studies about school kids who seemingly had adequate or high intelligence, who didn't have any clearly demarkable physical issues, disabilities, but couldn't focus, didn't seem to follow rules, et cetera, et cetera. So over the last 100 or so years, this phenomenon has been called everything from a moral defect, not meaning you're immoral, but that you didn't have something upstairs to kind of guide you to the right ways of behaving, to something called minimal brain damage or minimal brain dysfunction, which interestingly kicked up in the wake of World War I with the huge Spanish flu epidemic that pounded the world. And many survivors of that influenza became unfocused and impulsive and sometimes aggressive and had learning problems. So here was the first sign that there may be a brain issue that might lead to the symptoms of what we today call ADHD. It's a mistake, however, to think that anytime anybody has ADHD, there's a flu virus in there or some direct biological cause. So over the years, MBD, hyperkinesis, hyperactivity, these are the symptoms of boys who have what we today call the combined form of ADHD. You're not just having trouble focusing, but you're impulsive and squirmy and fidgety. One of the classic rating scale items is axis driven by a motor, which put girls at a disadvantage because more girls than boys have the more purely inattentive form of ADHD.
Sure.
So finally, in this brief historical tour, in 1980, the term ADD came out, attention deficit disorder, which you could have with or without hyperactivity. And just to confuse everyone, the American Psychiatric Association said a few years later, well, let's call it ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but you might have a form of it without the hyperactivity.
Right.
So it's very confusing
and misleading.
So here's what it is and is not. Attention deficit disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Well, it's a deficit in paying attention. That's a misnomer. Many people with ADHD can what we call hyperfocus.
Yes.
You get into an activity that you're intrinsically rewarded for or love, and 10 hours later, without bathroom breaks or eating, it's like, hey, you got to get into something else. So ADHD is a disorder, a condition involving the ability to regulate your attention and your focus as situations shift. It comes out most when the task is really rote or sometimes boring. Did the human brain evolve to learn to read or sit still in classrooms when we were young? No. We've spoken ever since we were a species, the last 200,000 years. Writing, 6,000 years. Compulsory education, 200 years. We're asking kids to do things for which the human brain never evolved to do. So what's really interesting to me is if you go around the world, maybe not in subsistence cultures where the main problem is food and there's no compulsory education, 5 to 6 to 7% of kids around the world meet criteria for ADHD. It's remarkably consistent. The two big exceptions are the United States and Israel that have about double that rate, which may mean that in very performance academic driven societies, we're maybe overdiagnosing in some cases, but girls still get underdiagnosed.
Sure.
And the myth that it's, you just can't pay attention. Everybody can pay attention if they just try harder, belies the fact that in a number of brain regions and circuits, there's a genetic vulnerability to not regulating. Kids take a long time to learn to read and to learn to sit still. If you've got ADHD, you're going to need extra rewards. You might need medication in order to get to the point of developing intrinsic rewards and helping to self-regulate. So let's not think that ADHD is just the inability to pay attention, but let's not think either that it's just all about permissive classrooms or strict classrooms or bad parenting. Those kinds of features in the environment can exacerbate ADHD. Parents start to get locked horns with their kids, but genes are primarily the driver of why person X has ADHD and person Y and Z fall just short or way short of the diagnostic criteria. But remember, genes don't work in isolation. Anybody with a genetic vulnerability or predisposition may thrive in certain settings and have more difficulties in others.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is so important, because people often believe that they have ADHD when in fact it's actually they're not sleeping well and they're medicating their child with Coca-Cola at 8:30 at night and they're manifesting these ADHD symptoms such as a discrepancy between their abilities and their performance, which I think is a fairly good kind of container for ADHD, discrepancy between ability and performance. But the cause of the discrepancy is often overlooked. And I think that many boys may be overly diagnosed with the condition when they may, in fact, have something else going on. And it sounds like girls are definitely underdiagnosed relative to the incidence rate.
So this is starting to change, fortunately, as knowledge gets out there. My research team and I, 27 years ago, wrote a grant to the National Institute of Mental Health to use our summer camp methodology, and we hoped long-term follow-up, to see whether ADHD really did exist in girls, how it looked similarly to, differently from how it does in boys. And this has now been, always got to have an acronym. This is the Berkeley Girls with ADHD Longitudinal Study. And long story short, along with only a couple of other large-scale studies going on around the world in these last 25 years, ADHD does exist in girls. It doesn't exist in girls at the same rate as in boys. Now, this is true for autism spectrum disorders. It's true for Tourette's. It's true for some forms of learning disability. It's true for early onset super aggressive behavior. Boys, out of the gate, if you will, out of the chute, have slower brain development than girls. They're slower to develop language. They're not as intrinsically empathic. So little wonder that boys would have neurodevelopmental conditions about self-regulation or social skills, et cetera, autism spectrum. However, for much of the last 200 years of psychiatric and medical and psychological history, the rates have been coming out of clinics, 10 boys to a girl or 20 or 30. It's as though if a girl had some of these symptoms, it had to be anxiety or she had to have been maltreated. ADHD or whatever it was called back then just didn't exist. Now, interestingly, this is true in medicine. 30 years ago, the National Institutes of Health made all applicants for any federal money to do research to justify the inclusion of females as well as males and ultimately different racial and ethnic groups. There's not much, even today in 2022, nearly as much about coronary artery disease in women as there is in men. It's just as much of a killer. But the stereotype is men get heart attacks, women don't. Even if you go to basic research on mice or primates, the majority of the research is done on male species only. Males don't speak.
What's going on here?
It's an inherent bias. Females have these hormones. They're different. They're not the same as, and the standard is males.
So even with something as grave as coronary artery disease, women are diagnostically overshadowed compared to males.
And in terms of treatment recommendations, they're based mainly on male research. Now, the curve has been almost gone around. The tide is turning. Females are represented in research far more than they used to be. But the lingering effects are that many clinicians and even researchers out there think ADHD is a guy thing. Coronary artery disease is a guy thing. Depression is only a woman thing. Now, there are twice as many women as men with major depression, but men, eating disorders, predominantly women, but men are increasingly recognized as being at risk too. We've got to have a level playing field, socioeconomically, racially, ethnically, gender-wise, if we're going to really make discoveries that help people.
What a great point. And how symptoms may manifest depending on gender, socioeconomic status, a host of other factors really can be a difference maker. One of the things before we get into the weeds on how it shows up for girls that I just wanted to suss out with you is that for ADHD to be actually on board, the symptoms need to be present in at least two contexts. Do you agree with that? Okay.
If a kid, let's take a sort of boy with the sort of stereotype, is angelic during homework and folded for 30 minutes every meal, but he and his classmates are very disruptive in school, we might look at that school context, right? ADHD, the genetic propensity to not regulate yourself very well, to be slower than others, to develop the sense of intrinsic motivation. These symptoms can play out differently in different contexts. So maybe when you're in middle school, the algebra teacher gets it, provides structure, knows how to give visual and auditory cues to the kid with ADHD. But the English teacher, it's my way or the highway.
Right.
So ADHD is marked by consistent inconsistency. So I'm going to make a kind of researchy point here, but I think it's important. People ask me and colleagues of mine all the time. So we want to pinpoint kind of where in the mind ADHD exists. Is it problems with what we call working memory? You can't remember a string of information or digits.
Sure.
Or is it inhibitory control? You've been rewarded for a response, but now you got to push that aside and work for another goal. The answer is none of the above or all of the above. There's not one specific kind of task that's inherently more difficult than other tasks with people with ADHD. The biggest finding is no matter what the task is, people with ADHD are more inconsistent and variable in their responding. Tension waxes and wanes. You get distracted and you come back. So this is called response variability and what's a highfalutin term. But it means that people with ADHD struggle with how to get engaged, how to stay engaged, and how to prevent attention from waxing and waning. We all wax and wane attention depending on whether the stuff we're doing is boring or interesting. But ADHD is best viewed as a condition of self-regulation.
I think that's great. And told you offline that and I'm very out with this, that I was diagnosed with the more typical female presentation of ADHD, the inattentive type, rather than the hyperactive, like swinging from the chandelier, or the mixed type where I was oscillating between both. At 28 years old, was diagnosed by Hugh Riedel-Huber. I went to the Long's Drugs parking lot, took 10 milligrams of Ritalin and sat and watched. And I immediately had this thought of, oh my gosh, this is what it's like to be normal. And I'm thinking about just how tragic it is that so many females go through life with this condition, not knowing, just assuming that there's something else going on. Maybe I'm lazy or I'm ditzy or fill in the blank. And I'm wondering if you could just get into, how does it present itself for girls and women? How is it divergent from the typical male presentation?
So in the summer programs we've run for years, first for boys and then for girls, and done follow-up studies, we find a number of girls with ADHD with this combined form, the combination of inattention and hyperactivity, impulsivity, as you were referring, will look a lot like boys with ADHD. They're kind of hell on wheels. They're disruptive in a classroom, can't sit still for very long, et cetera, et cetera. But if you go to a whole population, not just a clinic, because the clinics are going to be filled with kids who are more disruptive, girls are more likely than boys to have this more exclusively inattentive, distractible, forgetful, sometimes spacey, erratic presentation. They're not typically bothering other people.
Yep.
They're sitting and suffering in silence in a classroom because the teacher says they're lazy, or it must be depression, or it must be, a million other things. As well, even for a girl who has this combined, again, the combination of inattention and hyperactive impulsive behaviors, for kids like that who, in a binary are female, the predominant symptom may be hyper talkativeness rather than hyperactivity. Interrupting constantly. Now, people think if you interrupt, you're being rude. But let's say you have ADHD and you're having trouble following a long string of a conversation, you might interrupt so you don't forget.
Totally.
It seems rude, but in fact, you're trying to compensate for the fact I might not remember point A when my fellow speaker's at point Z.
Just trying to put a little space.
That's right.
Yeah.
So over the years, girls were pretty much ignored and neglected for neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD. We're now finding in national surveys, both in the United States and many other countries, that it's about 2.5 boys for every girl. Now, some people say if we just focus only on the inattentive symptoms or the hypertalkativeness, it clearly would be even. I don't think so. There are twice as many women than men with major depression for a host of genetic and biological and social cultural reasons. I believe there are more boys than girls with the classic neurodevelopmental disorders, ADHD, autism, spectrum, Tourette's, etc., but not as far many more as we used to think. It's still common, especially for someone who trained in medicine or psychology or psychiatry, what have you, years ago, that it can't be ADHD if it's a girl, and we know it can. Now, what's really interesting is that if you open an ADHD clinic for women or for adults, it's going to be closer to 1.5 men to women. So what's going on here? The inattentive symptoms tend to persist over time longer than the hyperactivity symptoms. I mean, it's true in everybody, especially people with ADHD. So girls may have a form of ADHD that's more likely to be lifelong than in boys. Second, girls, again, I don't mean to be stereotypic here, but more than boys on average are perfectionists and want to do well, and they garner a lot of support. One teacher during primary school. Now this thing called middle school hits, where by 8th grade, you've got 4 or 5 or 6 teachers, and then high school, and then post-secondary education. Girls may have their ADHD symptoms, especially the inattentive ones, masked for a long time because of their coping and compensatory strategies, and everybody's trying to help them out. So my new book, Straight Talk About ADHD in Girls, Sarah Chung, who's out in the open about this,
right?
Grad student at Berkeley. I chaired her qualifying exams. And in her latter years of grad school at age 31, she finally got a diagnosis of what she had suspected since she was a child, growing up in an immigrant Chinese family, moving to the United States, that she wasn't just lazy, or she wasn't just not motivated, very bright, but trouble following a conversation, multi-part demands, but especially in her cultural background, this was not discussed and thought not to exist, etc. And so finally, on her way to getting her doctorate, the diagnosis and the support, and for her, as for you, medication works. It works for many people with ADHD, not everyone. it's as though her life has taken a different turn. And she finally feels, as she explains in the book, and we were just on the radio forum the other day, you gain a different perspective that you're not a failure all the time.
Yeah. And that was a great interview, by the way. So what would be the symptoms that appear to be perhaps telltale sign that a girl or perhaps a woman who's been overlooked throughout her life might want to go in for some type of an evaluation to find out, is ADHD in the mix?
So a lot of times such a girl or woman and the girl's family or teachers are saying she's really anxious and she seems sad and depressed, hopeless. Now, there is something called anxiety disorder and major depression.
Of course.
But often people with ADHD have those as secondary conditions as well. It's called comorbid disorders. Too often we thought it's only the depression or anxiety or the PTSD. It's not the ADHD. So they can exist together. And so even though there's been some talk in the scientific journals over the last few years that maybe some people go along just fine and one day at 25 or 30 or 50 or 80 have ADHD, that's probably not the case unless you've had a head injury or you've taken drugs you shouldn't have taken. In most cases, there's been patterns there since childhood. But again, for a girl, coping, perfectionism, maybe the cost of that's anxiety. When the material gets harder or gets really rote, it's like the rings of a tree. You go back to third grade and the very supportive teacher said, boy, if she only put out more consistent effort, but I really appreciate her. And the fourth and fifth grade teachers say, she just doesn't try. And one of the telltale signs is the alphabet, every grade from A to F on a single report card is inconsistency. It's the trouble remembering what to do in sequence when the work gets hard or the work gets boring. And so we find for girls and women, puberty and its hormones, childbearing, perimenopause, menopause, there's more biological triggers that might unearth some of these symptoms as the girl matures into a woman as well.
Yeah. So you also cited some things that shocked me, actually, because they're not really, to my knowledge, written about in the DSM. That's sometimes in a female presentation, it may include self-injury and sometimes even suicidal self-injury or non-suicidal self-injury. And I was wondering, is that a byproduct of the comorbid or the concomitant, or perhaps the fact that ADHD serves as a precedent for anxiety or depression that causes them to need to self-soothe with these harmful measures?
So to make a very long story short, over the years, researchers have been following up boys with ADHD into adolescence and adulthood, and sometimes even into middle age, until the Massachusetts General Study and the BGAL study in the last 20, 25 years have come about. We just haven't had long-term follow-up studies of girls, or there's just been a handful, 3 girls out of the 100 in a big sample. By and large, as you go over time, boys and girls with ADHD continue to have academic problems, again, especially in difficult material or rote work. They both tend to have problems with peers and then later on close relationships. These are kids and adults who often don't read social cues. It's not just that you're not paying attention to homework or what the boss is saying, but to the subtle cues your partner may be putting in.
Sure.
Boys seem to be, although there's mixed evidence across samples, at somewhat more risk for illicit substance use if they have ADHD than girls, although both boys and girls are at risk for the overuse of nicotine. What we found in the BGAL study, we started to publish these results 10 years ago when the girls were now young women in their early 20s, and we're following them up into their 30s now at our 5th wave, is that a shocking number are starting to engage in their teen years and their early adult years in NSSI, cutting, burning, self-mutilation. The intent is not to do yourself in, to kill yourself, but it's to somehow express a deep pain that's hard to put.
And by the way, just for the listener, NSSI stands for non-suicidal self-injury.
That's right. NSSI. So it's non-suicidal intent, but it still can be very injurious to you. Or frank attempted suicide. In fact, by the age of the early 20s, there were 3 to 4 or 4.5 greater rates of both NSSI and attempted suicide in our girls with ADHD than in our normed neurotypical comparison group. Now, it turns out that in the last few years in Scandinavia, which is always ahead of the curve because they've got population studies, and in the US and in other cultures and countries.
Sure.
As you're an adult with ADHD, there's about a twofold greater risk of attempted or completed suicide than in comparison to kids.
Wow.
So the lifelong toll of feeling like a failure, getting fired from jobs, relationships aren't doing what you want, some of the poor health-related behaviors, obesity can be linked to ADHD, coronary artery disease is increased as people get older. So there's real long-term consequences, but still girls in general, compared to boys, are more at risk for NSSI, non-suicidal self-injury, again, and attempted suicide. And if you have ADHD and a history of it, even pushes that risk up. And the final fact, which we confirmed in several replications of our study at this point, is that if you're a girl with carefully diagnosed ADHD, and we would do a 9-hour assessment before our camps. Yeah, we can do what most clinicians in the community can.
You were quite thorough.
And if through a very diligent search, we had found that you'd been physically abused or sexually abused or neglected or some combination, that doubled the risk for severe NSSI and attempted suicide. So ADHD, to get statistical, has a heritability. That's a percentage from 0 to 100. Doesn't mean you have ADHD because 80% of your genes are in a different way. It means that why some people have ADHD and most people don't is 80% related to genetic differences between those people, not environments. Autism's about 90% heritable. Schizophrenia is about 65 or 70% heritable. So ADHD's well up there. But despite that genetic predisposition, if you've been maltreated and traumatized early, just as the case with bipolar disorder, which is even more heritable than ADHD, rate for self-injury and suicide practically doubles. So it's not biology or context. It's not genes or very insecure attachment. It's often both together that create the most difficult outcomes, especially for girls and women.
So one of the things that I have come to really appreciate about you is that you care about stigma as a thing. You've even shared on other forums the etymology of the word. And there's so much stigma, even in this day and age, around medication, around psychotherapy, around diagnoses in general. And yet we know that one of the first lines of defense for ADHD is medication. Many people have difficulty with that. Some people even say it's a moral issue still to this day, which it's clearly not.
Poisoning young kids' minds.
Right. First off, how would you address the stigma around the medication component versus how effective it actually is?
Well, I'm going to take a step back, Adam, and go to the stigma around ADHD itself first.
Sure.
So one of the first rules in stigma studies and research is HIV is more stigmatized than the flu. Chronicity, severity.
Totally.
Schizophrenia, hearing voices, chronic thought disorder is more stigmatized than having an adjustment disorder or mild anxiety.
Sure.
Except, what about a condition that's marked by consistent inconsistency? What about a condition that's marked by an inherent self-regulatory deficit? You're fine in geometry and not so good in French. Well, I saw you trying earlier, or you did well in practice, but in that key soccer game, you goalie with ADHD were so interested in the clover that the winning goal of the other team scored by your ear. For sometimes milder and certainly less consistently presented conditions, we make the attribution that the person just isn't trying hard enough. We know they can do it. So interesting research from England from some years back, parents of kids either with very severe autism spectrum disorders, often nonverbal, but the teachers and the fellow students would rally around them, compared to parents of kids with what we used to call Asperger's, high functioning autism these days. It's the latter group of parents who say that the teachers and the other kids say, he's just weird or she's just out of it. The attribution is you look like you can do it, but if you can't, that big gap, it must be, again, not an animal or evil spirit like through much of human history, like poor character, morally flawed, just not trying hard enough. So there's a lot of stigma around conditions like ADHD, in fact, higher than what you might expect. And second, what about treatment? You're going to go see a head shrinker? Gee, that's a non-stigmatizing name for a psychiatrist or psychologist. I mean, the very terms you need your head shrunk. There's something wrong with you. bats in the belfry, you're nuts. I mean, you go through all these very derogatory terms.
For sure.
And the idea that you might need a pill. And most effective treatments for ADHD are stimulant medications, which is sort of a misnomer. They're not really stimulating you to be more hyperactive. They're helping your brain to regulate. It's stimulating the inhibitory control centers of the brain. Well, you don't need a pill. I'd do better if I had a pill too, or you're just not trying hard enough. Why do you need medication for depression? I've been sad too, Charlie. I've been sad too, Betty.
Sure.
A little bit, but for the presence of God, there go I. We're often kind of defended when we see people who aren't coping well, because maybe we're not as stable as we think we are.
Mm.
And so we kind of project onto such people it's their fault or how flawed of them to need medication treatment, or a very effective treatment for kids with ADHD is behavioral reward programs. For teens and adults is cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, organizational skills, anger management, time management and control. The best results on average occur for people who get the right dose of the right medication and get behavioral and cognitive behavioral support.
Yep.
That's what on average brings people as close to the normal range as we can get. But again, whatever health insurance national policy we have now, I'm still not sure. So there's structural barriers. But in terms of attitudes, if somebody or some group is stigmatized, if I'm a member of that group, I'm likely to self-stigmatize. I don't deserve treatment. I'm kind of a bum like everybody thinks I am.
Yeah.
So stigma is a huge part of the problem. We think that we're starting to see in some national level data, for the first time in the last 70 years of doing this research, public attitudes toward depression seem to be less stigmatized.
I'm so glad to hear that.
We got a long way to go, but it's coming, I think.
And stigma and shame causes us to really contract and not deal with the thing that needs to be dealt with. We try to hide it away and go into denial. And I remember that when I was first diagnosed with this, I immediately shared it with my friends. I told them what I was planning on doing in terms of, because I knew that this was not the way I wanted to live my life. And through kind of a combination of the right medication, the right amount of the medication, paired with various cognitive drills, I actually called it my own version of Navy SEALs boot camp for the next few years, because I really wanted to transcend it.
Yep.
And it worked. And quite frankly, now I consider most of whatever's left over to be actually an advantage. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about what might be some of the advantages, particularly after treatment is successful.
Yeah. I mean, we're such a dichotomized world these days. Some ADHD experts say, well, ADHD is a hidden gift and it's only positive and you should never treat or medicate. Bipolar disorder, probably the most lethal condition on earth in terms of suicide. Well, that's where creativity sparks. You'd never treat with a mood stabilizer or lithium, and that's mythical. But it's equally mythical to say ADHD is caused by bad genes or bipolar disorder by bad genes. Why would they still exist in the human gene pool if they were inherently bad?
Right.
The most successful people in most societies are the parents and kids and siblings of people with bipolar disorder. They got a partial genetic loading, some of the spark, but maybe not the despair.
Right.
People who, and ADHD is very heritable. If you got some ADHD-ness, you think outside the box.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be good to be a little bit impulsive and not so over-controlled all the time. Great to have a range of ideas. Now, sometimes you have to filter them. And so it's a balance between the strengths that exist, and people with learning disorders may be very good spatially, not so much with literacy and symbols. Mr. Chuck Schwab, who founded the Schwab UCSF, UC Berkeley Diversity, Dyslexia and Cognitive Diversity Center that I co-direct, himself is out of the closet that he got diagnosed with dyslexia in his 40s. He had always been spatial and creative. He designed his neighborhood investment centers graphically without a lot of numbers and letters on them, so it would be easy for everyone to use. Many successful people include those with ADHD, as long as the distractibility and as long as the poor working memory and sometimes just the overload don't get in the way. So successful treatment stops the vicious cycle, makes everybody more accepting, and people, not only the person himself or herself, but the world at large, sees the real strengths that can emerge.
Love that. And what in your experience, has been, in addition to CBT and medication, what have been some other ways of assisting people through what could otherwise be the deficits associated with ADHD?
Go to the websites for autism and ADHD and prepare to be both inspired and depressed, because everybody's got the magic cure-all, which it doesn't work that way with neurodevelopmental disorders.
Right.
So medications for ADHD, the stimulants, they should really be called SDRI, selective dopamine reuptake inhibitors. Dopamine flowing in the brain more regularly, just the way an SSRI keeps serotonin for depression and anxiety flowing more regularly. Cognitive behavior therapy, again, organization, anger management, time management. Been a lot of interest in diet. The old studies from 50 years ago, right down the road from both of us at Oakland Kaiser, the Feingold diet. Dr. Feingold said, if you just take out additives and dyes and salicylates, I get a 70% cure rate. But there was no control group. And for a parent to control a kid's diet that much means they're probably the world's most effective behavior manager. So we now know that diet is not a miracle cure for ADHD, but especially for kids and especially with certain food dyes, they may add a symptom or three. So a healthy diet and another one, aerobic exercise.
Huge.
There's now enough studies out there to show that 30 minutes a day of aerobic exercise, it's not as powerful as medication on average. It's not as powerful as behavior therapy and cognitive behavior therapy, but it's part of a holistic treatment program for kids with ADHD.
Absolutely. And some others that I've come across have been obviously dialing in on your sleep.
Yep.
There is a co-occurring sleep disorder, obviously get that treated.
Absolutely.
And I found that certainly hydration and I guess just having a general team in general of people, whether it's an executive function coach, as well as the therapist and perhaps the medical professional, all of these people really contribute their own things to the puzzle.
Absolutely. So in the opening page or two of the first chapter of Straight Talk about ADHD in Girls, I invoke the principles from DBT, dialectical behavior therapy.
Excellent.
Which is a treatment for kids with and teens and adults with very severe emotional dysregulation, non-suicidal self-injury included, of radical acceptance and radical commitment. So what I tell parents of kids, girls in this book in particular, suspected of having ADHD and the diagnosis is confirmed, which again, doesn't take 15 minutes in a pediatrician's office. It's going to take some hours of work. That maybe this isn't the girl you expected. Maybe she interrupts more, or maybe she's not as quote, traditionally feminine, or maybe it's my way or the highway with her more than with your other kids. You're not going to change fundamentally that temperament, right? You got to accept. But at the same time, you got to commit to getting a reward chart in place, giving her the support, rewarding small steps of progress. Radical acceptance and commitment can go a long way to easing the stress and the strife and the arguments. And the biggest factor of all, find your kids, in this case, your daughter's strengths. What she loves to do can be the basis of rewards in a reward program, and maybe what she ends up doing most of the rest of her life. Maybe it's not the traditional sports academics. Everybody does well when they're supported for strengths. And that's where your notion of it takes a community comes into play too.
I love that. And you're speaking a bit about, in addition to strengths and really capitalizing on those and really sucking the marrow out of the bone and deriving a great return on investment of energy from really ascertaining and maximizing strengths. You're also speaking about contingencies and parenthetically positive reinforcement, perhaps instead of positive punishment.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit about what contingencies work. What are some other ways that a parent can support their child? And maybe even other significant others as well, such as spouses, without, of course, infantilizing their adult partner. But obviously, this is not the same protocol for children and adults. But
no, the refrigerator charts that work with a 7-year-old aren't going to work with a 7-year-old. Right? Tell you where to put that refrigerator. Principles are the same. Encouragement. Taking the world and dividing it into small steps. Rome wasn't built in a day. But my other kids didn't need those kind of reward well, kids with ADHD probably do more, and they may require medications that enhance dopamine more. The goal is to reverse the all too typical pattern. Adam, where's your homework? The school bus is here. You're late. If you don't sit at that dinner table, you'll never get dessert again for the rest of the year. Unenforceable.
Totally.
A nattering, right? It's the 5-to-1 negative to positive. Let's flip it. Let's have 5 positive for every negative.
Yeah.
What a great job today. I had the timer on and you got ready in 5 minutes from bedroom down to the breakfast table. And we didn't have a fuss getting it to school on time. Adam, look, checked off on your chart. Look, you completed homework. You didn't do every problem, but you got 80% right and you got on 80% all week. Flip to avoid the pestering that you've let me down. We call this in psychology, coercive cycles of discipline. Parents nag, natter, and kids complain. And then all of a sudden, the parent escalates to a slap or the kid threatens to leave the home and the house of cards just falls down.
Oh, yeah.
Positive, small steps, realizing Rome again wasn't going to and isn't going to be built in a day, gradual success, not trying to take on the world all at one time. If you get that positive tone going, I mean, how can a family or a teacher deliver deserved rewards for kids with ADHD unless they have a positive relationship with that kid? So it's about setting clear limits, but doing so in the most positive way possible.
And I love that idea of not just applying the same criteria to the neurotypical child to the non-neurotypical child. Obviously, we're going to need to do different things and be flexible. And there's a great book, I'm forgetting who wrote it. It's a Cornell professor, but it's called Far from the Tree, where it describes that phenomenon of
Andrew Solomon.
Thank you. I knew it was Solomon. Andrew Solomon. Wonderful. And there's even, I believe, a series on Amazon Prime where you can watch various docs about these parents whose children are very different from themselves.
Right.
And it's such an important reminder, like, of course they come from us. And of course there may be some similarities, but they are their own person. And I think in addition to knowing ADHD well and how it can present itself and how it presents itself with our children or our significant others is important, but it's also really important to just say, I also know my significant other. I know their strengths. I know who they are. And I formulate a personal communication style with them based on that knowledge.
I mean, there's another, we talked about cognitive behavior therapy, dialectical behavior therapy. A variant of all this is ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy.
Awesome.
I, as your partner or friend or colleague or workmate, I can't really change you. Now, I can help you work toward your goals and you can help me work toward my goals. But the idea that unless they're perfect, they're not meant for you. Boy, do kids pick up on that from parents. And can that spoil a relationship pretty quickly?
Really central to all of these, whether it's ACT or DBT or others, is mindfulness. And the best definition I've heard for mindfulness in years has been paying attention to what's going on while it's going on, not inflating it, not minimizing it, but just paying attention to what is happening. And that seems to also be a central aspect of treating one's own ADHD, and as well as to being supportive with your partner or child who has ADHD, being mindful.
You're so right. And it's kind of a paradox because we always say, well, we have to help people with ADHD plan. Planning is one of the great executive functions and work towards these future goals. But you do that best when you're in the moment. So it's not drop the moment now and say, if you always think ahead, you lose your presence in the moment right now. It's this dialectic. It's this paradox of staying focused now that helps you get to where you want to go.
I love that so much. So in the literature, in your experience, in your listening to testimonials from people with ADHD, as well as those who love them and support them, what have been some of your favorite life hacks that seem to work with a large population of ADHD, whether they're female or other genders?
So there's not one specific one or even a category. I think it's a lot about mindset. But then again, mindset also has to do with behaviors. Keep expectations one step ahead of where the individual is. If you expect perfection by the end of the week, that homeschool reward daily report card program is going to fail. If you expect to be uninterrupted in a nice, close, intimate conversation, and a week later, your partner's still interrupting, that's an unrealistic expectation. Break it into chunks, positively reward, take the time outs when things get too tense. That's important for kids and their parents. It's important for adult partners, for teens as they develop relationships. And kind of an old adage, well, those kids with ADHD don't need rewards, or those adults don't too. Well, I don't know about you, but I might not keep my job if I didn't get my paycheck, right? I mean, we all get some reward.
For sure.
Is that we get intrinsically motivated for stuff that we're really dedicated to as well. So we're all human. We all need sustenance emotionally, physically, nutritionally. And it's okay to be positive about telling someone when they're doing it well. And it's also okay, back to stigma. My book before this last one, Another Kind of Madness, A Journey Through the Stigma and Hope of Mental Illness, about my own family with severe mental illness on both sides of the family. And my dad's misdiagnosed bipolar disorder for 40 years, from his teenage years till his 50s. Well, I basically diagnosed him once I graduated from college because bipolar was so stigmatized and misdiagnosed in the US. I didn't know why my dad disappeared for 3 months, 6 months, or a year at a time. I thought I don't know if he's alive or dead. I didn't know that the lead doctor had said, if your children, my little sister and me, if we ever learned of what they thought was chronic schizophrenia and his hospitalizations, we'd be permanently destroyed. You and the family are forbidden from ever mentioning the topic of mental illness. That was the doctor's orders.
My God, I can't believe.
And this isn't in 1050. This was in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah.
Cancer from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, even 60s and 70s. You didn't put in the obituary of your great aunt or your grandpa who died of cancer because everybody knew that was a psychosomatic illness that you kind of brought on yourself because you've given up the will to live.
Oh my goodness.
So cancer has gone from a very stigmatized illness to a cause. NFL dudes wear pink knee socks once every fall. Breast cancer, it's a fight. Prostate cancer per man, et cetera, et cetera. Mental health is getting there, but it's still not there. It's still, you can't admit weakness. It's still shameful. You should pull yourself up by your bootstraps, all these old adages. And so keeping positive, but also admitting strengths and weaknesses and getting support and help. Everybody benefits.
Everybody benefits. Before I get to my last question, is there anything I should have asked about girls and ADHD, but haven't yet?
So we need 3 more hours, but risk of that.
Given the constraints.
People over in the UK, Susan Young is the lead author on this, and I cited it a lot in a piece that just came out earlier this year, 2022, in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, kind of a systematic review of girls and women with ADHD and some of the things we've talked about, why it's been so neglected for so long. And the point that Young and her colleagues made, and we found in our BGALS data too, is it's easy to overlook a symptom that isn't as disruptive and overt as the fidgety, squirmy, reckless behaviors of many boys with ADHD. And families and girls and their families in particular may work so hard to bury the ADHD because a clinician doesn't think it exists and it might be a flaw in the family, that when it does emerge, not till middle school or high school or college or work or grad schools we talked about earlier in the show, it's going to come out with more fury. Earlier intervention and prevention's the name of the game.
I love that so much. Wonderful. Well, my last question for you, Steve, is this, and I'm actually going to tailor it specifically to stigma since it relates so much to the field and your contributions to it, which I feel incredibly grateful. I mean, all a person needs to do is look at your Wikipedia page. They will see that you have directly assisted in reducing the stigma associated with various psychological conditions. If you could confer upon all humanity one insight or practice that would reduce stigma and perhaps shame around psychological conditions, what would that insight or practice be?
We're all in this together. And second, I learned this is a little longer answer. I learned in grad school, you had autism or you didn't. Today, they're called autism spectrum disorders. You had bipolar, you didn't. Now they're called the bipolar spectrum. ADHD is on a spectrum. All of us are on a number of continua of focus versus distractedness, conscientiousness versus being more of a slob, introversion versus extroversion. And there's no magic point on any of those where I'm disordered and you're neurotypical, Adam. We all share many propensities and they can be strengths if we get support for the strong parts of it and get help for the weakness.
That's fantastic. And yeah, it's even causing me to reconsider the term neurotypical, which I used earlier today. Thank you, Steve, for sharing your wisdom with my listeners. And I just am so grateful that you have contributed so massively during your lifetime to our field. It's an honor to sit with you.
Well, thank you. And you just gave me a reminder. I think I've got to update my Wikipedia page soon. I haven't done it in a few years. So
oh, yeah.
What with you?
Sure. I'm happy to have done that. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. And just a wonderful discussion, Adam. I'm really grateful.
Right on.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.